So we're shifting gear again to another industry, another sector, or subsector perhaps, fine chemicals. And delighted to have Nilay Shah, professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering, who led the fine chemicals report, which is here. You can get a copy outside. And as before, Nilay will just provide some food for thought from the study, from the report. And then we have another great panel here. We have Sharon Todd, Chief Executive of the SCI, which is the Society for Chemical Industries, okay, and Nishma Patel, who's the Policy Director at the Chemical Industries Association. So we're going to have a discussion around fine chemicals, where is it going, what can be done to make it more globally competitive. Nilay, over to
Great,
you.
thanks. So what I enjoyed about the previous sectors was a lot of the lessons could be also applied to this sector. But I think this sector is also a bit different in the sense that often it's not something we have great familiarity with, and it causes, I think, a lot of complexity with policy and prioritization and so on, because fine chemicals, generally speaking, aren't thought of as an industrial sector by themselves. And that's primarily because they're more of a foundation industry, and they're mostly part of a complex value chain, usually sitting in somewhere in the middle of a value chain and primarily bought and sold B2B. And so, what I'm showing here is we've got some of the families of fine chemicals on the left-hand side, but then it's really how they flow through an input-output analysis into the different end-use sectors, and the way in which they contribute to those end-use sectors is really important. And so they underpin the UK economy, but they're often somewhat invisible in the UK economy. So as you'll see in our report, we've done a landscape review where we've seen, the strengths. It's a well-established industry. In fact, one might argue the fine chemicals industry began in the UK, a few miles away from here in Greenford, and it was considered perhaps as Imperial College's first startup, which is making dyestuffs. We have a diversified set of products. We're proximate to many markets. We've got, of course, the science base that people talk about a lot, a highly skilled, but I would say aging workforce. Opportunities would be in the fact that the demand is there for all kinds of specialties. So all the sectors we heard about this morning and the sectors we'll hear about later on all require chemicals with specific functions and effect. We've got a capability of custom manufacturing, and that's something that can be enhanced with automation and Industry 4.0. We've got the net zero transition, which is going to be a complexity, but also an opportunity to produce new kinds of renewable based materials. And in terms of process innovation, manufacturing innovation, moving from traditional batch manufacturing to continuous manufacturing with much higher capital productivity. Weaknesses, we've heard this in many sectors, again, cost of energy in the UK. Raw material shortages, so we've got challenges in the UK in the sense that the chemical industry was at one point very integrated with a strong connection between the bulk and commodity end and this fine and specialty end. The UK has, to some extent, lost a lot of capacity in the bulk end, and so it's reliant on trade for a lot of the inputs. Skilled staff availability, recruitment and retention is a challenge. Probably the biggest challenge is the fact that the capabilities are now globalized. So countries like India and China in particular can produce high quality, innovative products. And some of the other threats are the regulatory environment, making sure we have alignment. Our chemicals industry is very open. We trade internationally. We need alignment. We have some other issues around public perception, and so the extent to which the industry is seen as a priority, I would say, is a bit of a challenge as well. So some of the recommendations are to develop a sector strategy that's specific for this almost subsector of the chemicals industry, and again to have that industry-led. So that'll be the second phase of our project. We'll be looking at that. Thinking about the enabling environment to enhance GVA and grow competitiveness. So thinking about the boundary conditions within which the industry operates from an economic and business perspective, but then also regulation and policy perspective. And you've got to think about things like REACH, for example. Further recommendations, again, you can see these are germane to many of the sectors. Skills roadmap. So, we've analysed in our report the different kinds of skills, the levels of qualifications that are relevant to the sector today, but also in the future to accommodate the advances in material design, for example, and novel manufacturing. Focus on the R&D of product innovation, because I think that's where the opportunities are in having products with high IP content, and so they're not so dependent on raw material cost competitiveness, labor cost competitiveness, or energy cost competitiveness. And then a mindset change, which is really around the thinking of what sovereign capabilities are important for us as a country. What are these platform chemicals that are underpinning our different industries and will play a greater role going forward? So thanks very much, and we're happy to take some questions and also hear some perspectives.
Thanks, Nilay. So there's really three things I want to cover in the panel. There's the challenges and opportunities that Nilay's outlined. Really get your response to those. And then secondly, I want to look at regulation and reach the harmonisation or divergence between regulations and what that means for the industry. And then thirdly, the thing I want to look at is it's in the report, you didn't mention it, but this long tail of small companies in the sector, and can anything be done to help those grow, become globally competitive companies? You mentioned IP. How do we support IP development? So those are the three areas. But can we just kick off with your response to what Nilay has outlined and from your perspectives? Maybe Nishma first.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So it's quite timely because this project, this report was published quite closely to a piece of work we did at CIA called Project 35, and essentially it was looking at that last bit you said, Nilay, around what is the sector strategy, where will the sector be in 10 years, and what are those key areas that we want to see sovereign capacity, because chemicals, as you rightly point out, is essential in everyday modern life. It goes across the board, and we cannot onshore everything. So what are our strategies? What are our subsectors that we really want to invest in the UK? So long story short, we did that piece of work. It looked at sort of the key, and this was across chemicals, not just fine, but it included fine and speciality as well. It looked at sort of the key importance around why chemicals are important and why we do need a manufacturing base in the UK. So it didn't just look at the sort of the macroeconomic value, but also the criticality, so some of our critical national infrastructure, such as defence, health, water. It also looked at some of those key growth sectors that have now been identified in the industrial strategy, and the impact that would have on the resilience of those sectors as well. So again, linking it to wind turbines and the key building blocks we need for that, solar panels, all the way to some of the defence materials as well. And then at the end of that, it did this sort of scenario mapping, worst case to glass half full to glass half empty, to under each of those scenarios, if we ended up there in the next 10 years, what would it be? The most likely one was the glass half full, the worst case. That's where we're heading based on current trajectory and policies and what that would mean. But equally, it looked at the opportunity to say, if we can shift some key policies, some key regulations, and I think you've mentioned some of those already, what are the opportunities? And the key areas that it really focused on were things like, and fine and speciality chemicals play a key role in that, around advanced recycling technologies, our input and capability to some key sectors, as I mentioned earlier, around clean energy, defence, both as key sectors of the industrial strategy. But beyond that, what do we do to deliver sort of transition for society more general? What are the bigger transitions we need as society in the UK? So if we're looking at heat pumps in our homes, if we're looking at battery charging and battery technology for electric vehicles, what are those key capabilities that we want? So there's lots there for the chemical industry to do. I think the key bit that is missing, and we find this quite hard as an association, is where do we want to focus our efforts on? And I think that's a key point that you outlined in your presentation.
Okay, Sharon.
Yes, thank you. So I'm glad that question was asked up, and hopefully you'll put fine chemicals into your word cloud when we've finished, because it's a really interesting sector that is little understood, and perhaps go back to a little bit of history to bring us up to today. So I think, as many of you know, the last industrial revolution was a pivotal part coming out of the UK. And it was all based on science, scientific discovery, and the emergence in particular of chemistry as a discipline, but chemistry then linking to other disciplines. I'm really glad you mentioned dyestuffs. As people, little known fact, I actually did start in dyestuffs. But how the industry evolved was that technology got adopted into new sectors and new areas. So the dyestuff technology that was started in around that period morphed and migrated into a whole agrochemical industry, which we know today, which then migrated, the same technology base, migrated into pharmaceuticals that we know today. And the industry was built up on being very integrated, large players who could invest heavily in science and technology and engineering, but another pivotal core competency to drive through these new technologies, big science changes and big technologies into multiple sectors. Over the years, that industry has fragmented, and that's a whole nother topic. If you want to be bored, I would be very happy to give you chapter and verse on what's happened, but it's now highly fragmented, and that has all sorts of implications, one being that we are now seeing this fine chemical sector being isolated and pulled out. It's actually the pivotal sector for science and scientific discovery still across the sector. It feeds into, a large part of it feeds into pharmaceutical. It is the kind of core essence of the clever stuff in pharmaceutical drugs, in agrochemical drugs, into consumer products and consumer healthcare as well. It's where all the clever science gets done, even though it's got a very strange label, which is probably just a historical label. Just to give you a flavour, in some areas, for example, in the pharmaceutical space, the chemists and the biochemists and the medchem people in that space would be developing processes that have 16 steps in them in order to make a new immunotherapy drug, for example. So it's not got a great title, but it's a really interesting space if you're a scientist, and it's definitely a space for the future. So with that backdrop in mind, I think it's really interesting, and the timing of this report from Imperial, because it sort of begs to the question about our science base in the UK. It is a fundamental sector. It's a sector that drives functionality and drives new science into a wide variety of other sectors. And for that purpose, it really should be called out, but should be better understood and better understood in terms of how we address it going forward. So I was really pleased to see the report, and we engaged in it. I think a couple of observations to just open up the discussion. I think it's great to see this government with a new industrial strategy, or an industrial strategy. Perhaps some came from a previous government, but it's great to see that they have laid down an industrial strategy. That is critical. We need to have a strategy for the future. We need to have longevity to it. And it's great to see sectors being called out. That's important. It is important to drive sectoral plans going forward. But there's a huge interconnectivity between sectors that is not perhaps well understood. And I think the Fine Chemicals report starts to address some of that, in particular with the high value materials that connect between sectors such as electronics, I mentioned consumer products, and into pharma and healthcare. So essentially, you're not going to really build solid sectors without having a strong fine chemical sector. That's an important point. I think then, in terms of how we should look at this going forward and some of the sort of issues and challenges, the level of integration is a really important conceptual point. I think in terms of competitiveness, it does help drive competitiveness. And I think it's something as a country we should be looking at, this kind of integrated nature, in particular around identifying which sectors we need levels of integration in. And why is that important? It's important because it drives our investment and our science base, and it connects directly to fine chemicals in here as well. So I think some stripping apart of the fine chemical sector and focusing in certain areas, I think might be a really interesting place to go forward. It's certainly got some big challenges associated with it. I think the point about startups I'd like to pick up, because it's an area we work heavily in SCI. We did a study last year of 100 of our high growth SMEs, and they bridge a wide range of science sectors. And 40% of them said that they were going to list or grow outside of the UK. And I think this is now quite a well-trodden, well-understood sort of pathway, but we have big issues with scaling of SMEs in the UK. And by scaling, I mean getting them to manufacture and or list, not just getting bigger, but getting them to a delivery point. And there's a lot of value in manufacturing that we haven't really, I think, fully understood yet in the UK. And to make sure they then bed and grow and become sort of domiciled effectively and very successful, hopefully, out of the UK. And there's all sorts of work going on around different aspects of that, around the pension fund reforms, which the Chancellor is leading on, around trying to get adequate money in. Science is a particularly challenging area because of the large capital intensity needed over the long periods of time. But one thing I did want to pick out is I think there's a really important ecosystem, it's back to my point about integration, of large company and small company that we need to really grasp in this industrial strategy. We're not going to grow in scale successfully, companies in science, in my view, unless we have the large companies working alongside them and helping support them in a clustered kind of approach. And I was fascinated by the semiconductor example, great place of cross-learning that was put down this morning. Because that absolutely is a model. We need the large companies to be supporting not just the science, but the startups and the SMEs as well. So our industrial strategy needs to have a strand around integration. It needs to have a strand around the large companies and making sure we're investing. And my third point, my final point, is that we also need to have a strand around being competitive. And it does relate to the point about the large company piece. We did some pieces of work last year, in particular in life sciences, which is a big area of focus for us at SCI. And the UK is drifting. It is drifting from a competitiveness point of view, and we really can't rest on our laurels. We have been moving backwards on FDI, foreign direct investment. We've been moving backwards. Several people mentioned exports this morning. We've been moving backwards on manufacturing. You need manufacturing in order to export. And we need to go back to the hard data and really look at it and understand what is going on and how we can get the UK back into a competitive place for investment. We have been losing, we estimated in life sciences alone, 15 billion per annum in life sciences alone in FDI investment in the UK. That's over a 20-year period. So I think this piece about, it's great we've got an industrial strategy on the table. We're very supportive of it. We all should be very supportive of it. We need an execution plan. We need detailed execution plans that sit alongside it. And we need to understand the core fundamental underpins that are going to make that plan as successful as it can be for the UK. And I would suggest that fine chemicals as a sector, even though it's got a strange title, is a really critical component of that, and you should definitely add it to your word cloud. Thank you.
Okay. We've heard a lot, but a couple of things I haven't heard from both of you, which is, first of all, competition from overseas, particularly China and India, and then the general domestic business environment, whether that's energy costs, planning regulations, skills, availability of skilled workforce. I mean, what do you think about those points?
I can start. And Sharon, you mentioned hard data. It's a good point because we did some of this within CIA because we have seen some of those large companies exit the UK market. So we looked at carbon emissions first, and it was great news. We saw 40% reduction in our carbon emissions. Felt great, and that was in the last 5 years. We then looked at our production data. 40% reduction in our production data. Not so great news. So the point there is that we need to look at our regulatory piece again. Some of these regulations and policies we've had, and I can name a few around sort of emissions trading scheme, our climate change levy, designed probably 5, maybe 10 years ago, don't quite look to drive the same incentives to decarbonize and transition the industry in a way that it should do. In fact, for some of them, where they look to switch to, for example, to power or to heat pumps, or where they look to switch to more circular models, it would actually do the opposite. It could look to penalise them, and you're paying additional levies and additional taxes. So there's a big piece there to do quite urgently, that just within our existing policy framework, there's some quick low-hanging fruits we could change to just make that operational capability in the UK easier, or more, or facilitate it a bit more. So that's one piece I think we've got here as a competitive disadvantage opposite other countries.
David Billett's in the room for this. He's gone, I think.
And then the second part of that is energy costs. It's the elephant in the room, and it's not an easy one to solve. We are the highest globally in terms of industrial power prices, for not just for the sector, but for manufacturing across. Chemicals and other energy intensive sectors feel it more because we are more trade exposed, and obviously we are more energy intensive as well. We are doing some things around wholesale costs, so, bringing more renewables on board and so on. So we are more reliant, and we can control that cost more. But equally, again, for decades, we've looked at this policy, the approach where the cost of bringing those renewables in for funding the infrastructure and the grid is paid by the consumers, whether that's domestic or industrial. Other countries don't have that same policy levy cost that we do here in the UK. So where you have got an operational cost, and the levies and taxes just from an energy perspective for the industry is 1.5 billion a year, and that's just the chemicals industry. You don't have those levies, or nowhere near half of those levies, in the US or China or the Far East or even in the Middle East. So that's where the competitive disadvantage. It's the energy cost, and I think it's a cumulative regulatory burden. That's not saying regulation is a bad thing. Regulation can actually spur innovation, but we need to make sure it does that. It does what it says on the tin. So I would say those are the two key areas that, if we got some good urgent action on, might help competitive advantage.
Regulation in this instance, meaning it's the sort of ancillary stuff like sustainability standards, rather than, lots of talk about REACH and harmonisation or divergence with Europe.
REACH is one area.
That's more about the chemicals themselves, but how does that fit into the picture here?
So REACH is, so I guess the other part of regulation is certainty. So REACH, since we've left the EU, we've had a UK REACH, but some of the issues that came about from leaving the EU with UK REACH are yet to be resolved. So, for example, we're yet to know what data you need, and how much you'll be paying for this data to bring a product onto the UK market. Now, that doesn't only bring uncertainty to the existing pool of products we have on the UK market, but new innovations. If you're looking to move away and transition away from existing substances to new, more cleaner, sustainable innovations, UK is probably going to be last on your list because you are not sure what the investment is in terms of that specific regulation. One option is that we just align with the EU. That's fine, that's fair. We're taking regulatory decisions from another jurisdiction. We can do that, but that still doesn't resolve the issue that you would still need a license to market here in the UK. So that alignment piece doesn't resolve the cost piece and the uncertainty piece. So it can help in some areas, but certainly not resolve all the core issues around REACH.
I think we have about 7 minutes left. Sharon, I want to turn to this question of small companies, alignments with big companies. As I understand it, there are a couple of big, there's Johnson Matthey, there's Syngenta and so on, a couple of big companies, but this long tail of small companies. Is the problem that we simply have too many small companies? What proportion of those companies are genuinely innovative, or are they just kind of bumping along as a sort of mom and pop company? Yeah. which I have heard from people. And it's similar to BioPharma, where there's a couple of giants and then a long tail of 700 or 800 small BioPharma companies, which always fail to grow. So, yes,
I'll try and answer the question diplomatically. We should spur innovation and encourage and excite people to set up businesses and to try and grow businesses. That absolutely, I think we would all support. I think where it becomes more challenging is trying to support every company through every point. And again, I was interested in the in the examples given this morning around some of the cluster approaches in other areas. And that's not to say that the UK needs to be making choices all the time, but it does actually have to put some money down, or more of the money, less spread betting across a wide range of companies and organisations, and some of that money deployed to accelerating some of them through to grow and scale. And in the area of science, it's very different from tech. The amount of capital needed, the time to market, the patent portfolios, for example, is just a fundamentally different investment profile. And so that, I think, in science that more is needed to be done. So I think we could be smarter around our deployment of capital and support around that big set of companies. As I say, we tend to focus on the TRL 3-4 upwards from that. But I do want to drum home a really, really, really important point. We need the large companies. And we have been losing large companies for the last 20, certainly over my career, 20, 30 years. And we should all be really concerned about that. I was at the Labour Party conference the other week, and it was fabulous listening to our new business secretary on the day that AstraZeneca announced that they're going to dual list in the US. And this has been a long time coming of lack of attention, competitive environment elsewhere, losing investment from the UK. And this is a company with 170 billion market cap, gestated in the UK. It came out of that history I talked about. It came out of dyestuffs, if that came from an imperial company, and, all of that, I've never run the numbers on how much has been invested to get that company to that case. We need to take care with these large companies because we don't have many of them left. Johnson Matthey, and that could be a start to listing out of the UK, as Anglo-American have just done recently. Johnson Matthey is another case in point. One of our founders, George Matthey, 250 years old, great company, in the process of splitting up. There's a long story in there, mostly related to battery technology. But these companies, when they're strong and when they're bedded in the UK, they are a powerhouse for science to cluster around and to support startups to scale. They have process technology, they have skills in engineering, they have people who do that on a day-by-day basis, and the skill set that you need for scaling is fundamentally different from the skill set you need in the small scale in the lab. So I think we could do more around managing maybe that long pipeline more effectively, but we fundamentally need the large companies, and we should take care with where we are today.
Just lastly on that point, I mean, you said we shouldn't be making choices, picking winners, but I mean, there must be some things we simply won't. It's simply not economic to do.
Yes, no, I agree.
So really, it's the high value, high end, stuff.
And we could be, we could be allocating capital accordingly. Yeah. X% is for everybody, Y% is for people growing at a certain rate with certain competencies, or maybe a patent portfolio, strength in what they're doing, and then we could be smart about that deployment of capital.
Okay. I don't know how we're doing for time, but do we have time for a couple of questions from the floor, perhaps? So, yeah. Yes, there's one there. Yeah.
Rob Healing from Brightest. One of the things I see looking at a lot of fine chemicals businesses is a lot of the cost in a process is actually in separating the stuff once you've made it. And I'm using that as an example I feel there's an opportunity, and I'm interested in your views on it, for us to try and get a lot more pre-competitive collaboration around developing those technologies. It would be industry and academic. I think it has to be both, and it would need some funding as well.
Nishma, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is towards access to feedstock, that if we can keep things within the economy, because one of the big challenges is the cost and access to feedstock and also alternative feedstocks. And I think it's a good one for fine and specialty chemicals in particular. If we can find a way that we are perhaps less reliant, again, going back to the point that we can't onshore everything, and having more advanced technologies that can allow that, chemical recycling is one, but there are many others. I think it's a great opportunity, because you're not only reducing operational cost, and making it and facilitating UK manufacturing, you're actually environmentally ensuring that when things that perhaps shouldn't end up in waste or shouldn't be exported to waste isn't happening. So seeing waste as a resource,
I
that's
think
the word.
material
Thank
recovery,
you.
yeah, material recovery generally, I
Yes.
think is an exciting area, and because there's good opportunities with membranes, electrodialysis, novel thermal hybrid technologies. So yeah, it was a nice area to look into.
And I think that's another area where we've got a regulatory barrier in terms of waste regulation is actually a barrier to recycling.
Exactly.
And circular economy, as it currently stands.
Yeah. Maybe time for one more, perhaps.
Jason Ruthenade from K Research. So you mentioned the companies like Johnson Matthey in terms of their strengths around processing. I'm just wondering, is there any thought, do you have any thoughts around skills and training? So rather than concentrating on fundamental sciences and new advances in terms of IP generation, how about training and better training of the future workforce in terms of actually scaling up IP and scaling up technology so that it's actually on the path to being commercially viable?
I absolutely agree 150% with that. I think we need to shift again capital deployed to helping support scale up capability, and that's not something you can learn in a scientific degree. You need on the job experience. And again, the cluster approach I was very interested in. We'd like to do something in the spaces that we work in along a similar lines, because I think if we can help our startups very practically, we run sessions with them on how to develop a commercial patent portfolio. We're a charity, so we run that for free, and we get the patent companies to come and do that training for them. How to do it commercially. How do you scale up your process? Having people who work in process technology who've done 20 years to go onto your site or into your lab and help you literally with your science in that scaling process. I think it's right down at that practical level. I think you're absolutely right, and I think those are skills that we're in danger of losing because they're quite hidden skills as these companies are all changing and evolving and mostly downsizing at the moment. Those are often people who are disappearing out of our pool, and maybe we need to be thinking about capturing some of those people and getting them into making sure there are transferable skills. But they're very practical skills. They're things that come from 10, 20 years in industry.
Right. I've got one very last question, which I really need a quick answer, but what I'm getting from this is that not only is there a long tail of small companies, but it's very fragmented as well. So can it help itself, or is it just simply too fragmented to do that? It needs some guiding hand from above.
It can, but as Sharon said, needs are large companies.
Just the large companies.
I think it depends what you're trying to achieve. There's a long tail because there's lots of different scientific areas being explored as well. So I think it would depend on what is it you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
I think we're definitely at a crossroads, so I think it needs to happen. So it has to happen. So I think phase 2, where we'll try to develop this sector plan, is going to be critical. But I think Sharon's point is there are subsectors within the sector, and if we treat them as subsectors, that will help. Like the contract manufacturers, the dye stuffs, the catalysts. That would be a good way to engage.
Not unlike BioPharma then. Yeah. Okay. And when are we going to see that report? The strategy.
I think we said spring next year, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
Summer
All right.
next year. Yeah.
Thanks, Nilay. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Nishma.
Cheers.